These are a few clips from one of my latest projects aimed at rebuilding almost entirely a Gothic cathedral within Blender. But what does it really mean to engage into something this big, and how can we do that effectively? Let me share my perspective. First of all, these projects require quite a significant amount of effort. To give you a bit of context, building this scene took me around 60 hours of work, of which I would say approximately 80% were spent modeling, while the rest were used either texturing or lighting or compositing. The final scene contains nearly 21,000 objects organized into 201 collections. There are as well 50 different materials in use and 126 node groups, 41 of which are geometry node systems. Now, some of these are indeed just variants, or to put it differently, duplicates of a main asset with just little tweaks, but nevertheless, these numbers should give you quite the sense of the magnitude of the work involved. In the end, am I pleased with the final outcome? Well, as always, it's a yes and no. One of the most difficult parts in dealing with bit projects in general is to keep quality consistent throughout the process, whether you are at hour 5 or at hour 50. Exhaustion can indeed kill a project. To give you an example, I spent so much of my energies into modeling the main bits of the architecture, making sure that all the elements were arranged and interconnected in a way that would make sense, that when it came to texturing, for instance, the stained glasses, which is a big part for every Gothic cathedral, I really struggled in coming up with an effective workflow, even though I think I partly did in the end, to the point I have been on the edge a couple of times about whether to skip this step altogether. Apart from suffering from fatigue, there are always at least a couple of technical dimensions in which a project may fall a bit short. In my case, lighting is for sure one of these, and that's fine since I do consider each project to be a stepping stone into the next one, where each time I start something new, I try to focus more on a specific part of the process or workflow. So yes, in undertaking a big task, the first thing to me would be to be aware, prepared and trained in advance to face the amount of effort that that specific project will likely require. The second important element is to have some degree of visual clarity about the final intended result. Needless to say, some time needs indeed to be spent into the research department. For this purpose, I generally leverage on tools like Pinterest to create some boards and start exploring references. I even have a specific board called Hooks, in which I save images I may not be directly interested into, but that serve as a sort of an entry point thematically into a specific concept or visual representation I want to expand upon. Having said that, my target for this project wasn't anything specific, as it would have been instead in a proper replica, but rather a custom cathedral with inspiration being taken from different real sites. To mention a few, the cathedrals of Amiens and Reims in France and Cologne in Germany. Aside from references, one essential bit of the entire planning process is always to be aware as much as possible of what one is really looking and getting into. If I had to state it explicitly, it would go like this. To make it, you need first to be able to name it. This is not simply a mere exercise in style, but more that the moment you become aware of the presence of a certain specific element or component within a more complex structure, and knowing its name is a solid proof to yourself of the fact that you really are, you will properly account for that element, whether in your modeling or texturing process. This usually draws a line between a final output that appears plausible and one which seems to be okay, but for which you can't really put your fingers on what is actually off. Given that, I started the whole process by taking a floor plan of a cathedral, Amiens in this case, trying to figure out my portion of interest. Based on my personal perception and taste, the choir and the apse would be the most interesting parts. Not to disregard the rose windows, which are indeed peculiar in a Gothic cathedral, but I really wanted to come up with a final shot that would emphasize the concept of spatial depth and dimension, moving from the central nave, where I would put my main camera, crossing the transept into the choir, then into the apse through the ambulatory, and finally peeking into the chapels. So I knew roughly that I had to reproduce this much of a cathedral, and I started looking into how to decompose this structure into its own basic elements. In particular, by looking at this section here, the central nave and the lateral aisles, it was easy to see that once built, its repetition would allow to make up for the majority of the entire composition. So I zoomed in and focused on it. And these are the basic elements I knew I had to begin with. The arcade standing on its piers, the midsection or triforium, and the clerestory with its beautiful windows and traceries. On top of everything, the ribbed vault. And what I was particularly interested into was trying to replicate the amazing interplay of elements, with the ribs of the vault transitioning into the cluster of columns that would progressively descend down the whole structure right into the piers of the arcade. At this point, I had a plan. To start from the single constituent as to form this first composite element, which would then be used to build the main parts of the cathedral, or at least of my portion of interest. Let's now dive a bit into the modeling part of the project. This comprises both basic modeling techniques, and I will not bore you with this. In fact, you can check this older video here in case you wish to look into any of that, and more advanced stuff. In fact, to deal with larger projects, it's always useful to have a few tricks up the sleeves. Think about, for instance, the need to optimize a scene to make it manageable also at the later stages of the process. My first goal was to have in place all the different elements taking part in forming the nave of the cathedral with its subsections. I started almost from the ground up, building the main arcade first and then moving up to model the different pieces of the triforium. At this stage, I was just working on the basic shapes without including yet any elaborated model, such as the decorations for the columns' capitals. Let me stress how important it is to have everything properly named and diligently organized in collections. After building the triforium, I moved on to the clerestory. A big part of this is modeling the different pieces of the tracery that is put together along with the windows, and I tried to do that in the most, so to speak, organic way, by having shapes that are actually connected in their own geometries, or let's say topologically, much like it is in real life. Now, this is not strictly needed, as one could simply place the different elements on top or near each other, but I thought that doing it properly would give it a visual boost, plus it is a good exercise in terms of flow and polygons management. As I mentioned earlier, one of my goals was to try to replicate the complex interplay of the different elements being conceptually interconnected with each other. Hence, I started working right away on all those pieces that would contribute to that overall, and that taken individually may not appear as important. In all of this, scale is essential. When I work on these kind of things, I always do that in a real-world scale. And that is going to have an impact on almost everything, from bevels to textures to the way light interacts with the models. With the tracery done, I started adding simple planes to represent the windows. In the end, I would replace all the individual planes with just a single one, since it is easier to manage, especially when texturing stained glasses. With the clerestory done, it was time to move to the vault. Here, the technique is the one I already used in a couple of older videos, feel free to check them for reference. One little trick is in modeling the profile of the vault's ribs. I approached it like this. I hand-modeled a piece of geometry based on the specific reference I chose, and I placed it into its own collection, to be reused later on. I then isolated just the top edge, deleted the rest, placed it at the center of the 3D space and converted it into a curve. At this point, I could take my rib, which needs to be a curve as well, and I used the profile I just created as the input in the taper object field. I adjusted the rotation, and to make sure it was displayed properly on the rib, I applied the scale of the latter. This, apart from being a non-destructive way of modeling, allows for great flexibility and reusability. It is with ribs and the underlying columns that the interplay I mentioned starts to come to life. For this reason, I spent quite some time making sure that every piece of it would make sense considering the structure as a whole. To complete everything, I moved on to the piers of the arcade, again trying to respect as much as possible the natural flow of the different elements so that every one of them is placed according to the placement of all the others. At this point, I had one side of the nave completed. To get the other side done as well, and this is a first part of the optimization process, I decided not to use a standard mirror modifier as to avoid duplicating the existing geometry for each mirror piece. In cases like this, using instances is a far better option. Thus, I created a specific collection to contain the instanced mirror meshes, and I started right-click instancing the different blocks. Hence again the importance of having everything organized in a clear and logical way. With that done, it was enough to rotate each instance using as the pivot point the center of the vault, which, if things are done properly, should be right at the center of the 3D space. Since this entire composition will need to be repeated in an array fashion to create the overall shape of the quar, I needed to account for the fact that some of the meshes are placed right at the middle of what will be the consecutive iterations of the structure. Which means that if I take everything all together and just repeat it bluntly, a part of the geometry will necessarily overlap. To avoid this, I decided to split the block into two logical sections, isolating those meshes which lie in the middle of the block from the rest. This will allow me to manage the iterations of the two sections separately, as we will see in a minute, and avoid any geometry overlap. With the same logic, I approached the modeling of the two aisles, again leveraging on the logical subdivision between a midsection and the rest of the structure to avoid overlapping geometry further in the process. With the main parts basically completed, it was time now to move to some finer details, such as the decorations for the capitals. Apart from the modeling itself, which was performed along the lines of the non-destructive workflow I used for the leaves of the Corinthian capital, as demonstrated in this video here, the important bits were mainly two. The first, to apply also in this case the distinction between what will be in the middle of each repeated iteration of the block and what will not. And the second, to optimize the overall poly count. With regards to the latter, the obvious choice was to use geometry nodes, which I used at first to build the base capital by instancing the desired amount of leaves in a circular fashion, and then to allow for multiple iterations within the scene of these base capitals with little to no increase in the amount of geometry around. The same concepts were applied for both the decorations of the columns of the piers and of the aisles, and for the decorations of the columns of the triforium and clerestory. Finally, the base structure was complete and ready to be used in the next steps. For the quar, I created a new geometry node system. My intention was pretty clear in that I wanted to use two mesh line nodes to control separately the different collections depending on whether they belong to the midsection of the whole block or not. Hence, I started joining together the base nave and its mirror counterparts, feeding the result into the instance on points node linked to the first mesh line node. I then duplicated both the mesh line and instance on points nodes, and I joined them back into the original branch of the node tree with a join geometry node. I would use this second branch to control the different midsections of the cathedral. With this logic, I started adding the different pieces together, including the aisles 1 and 2, again with the respective mirror instances and the decorations for the capitals as well. With these two macro blocks ready, I could now work on increasing the iterations count for both mesh line nodes separately as to create the entire quar structure without having to deal with overlapping geometry and in an optimized way when it comes to the overall poly count of the model. With the quar ready, I moved on and started modeling the apse. For that, the fundamental part was working on its so-called umbrella shape, and in case you might need precise guidance on this, you can reference this video here. The rest is similar to what was already shown for the nave section. In particular, I first modeled the different items of a singular section of the apse, from the clerestory to the triforium and the arcade, and this was my original collection of meshes, and I then instanced the other iterations by simply creating instances of this original collection and rotating the instances around a pivot point placed at the center of the apse itself. I then proceeded to model the ambulatory and its sets of vaults displaced around the circular shape of the apse, and finally the chapels. The techniques I used in both cases are similar to what I did for the nave and the apse, where I leverage a lot on instances to be applied to every repeatable section as to optimize the overall poly count as much as possible, keeping the whole project manageable even with an already large number of objects in the scene. Let's now talk a bit about texturing. The main materials for the cathedral are conceptually not that many. There needs to be for sure a tiled stone material, which is going to be predominant in the composition, to be applied to vaults, columns and piers, a brick and plaster material for the vaults, something for the floor, and then stained glasses. For the tiled stone material, I downloaded from the web a nice scanned set of RGB textures and I imported them into Blender. Since I was using lots of instances throughout the composition and to avoid obvious repetitions with displayed textures, I separated the output of the texture coordinate node into the X, Y, and Z channels, and I then recombined them, adding just a bit of randomness by exploiting the random output of the object info node in combination with some math operation to be performed at each channel level. To emphasize the sense of separation among the different stones of the original set of textures, I used the roughness map as a source of information to be fed into a color ramp node to try to isolate the different crevices, finally to be used as a mask in a color mix node to make them more evident in the final output. I then imported some grunge maps to be mixed on top of both the albedo and roughness maps of the main material, just to add a bit of dirt and muddiness to its overall look. With this in place, I started applying the stone material where needed to all the different meshes in the composition. Moving on to the vault, I started with the standard bricks material to be applied to the target mesh, unwrapped in accordance to the intended direction of travel for the texture. With a separate BSDF shader, I added a plaster material, again based on scan PBR textures, and I mixed the two shaders with a mix shader node. To create the transition mask between the two materials, I fed the roughness map of the brick material into a color ramp node, and I used it as the input of the factor socket of the mix shader node. To enhance the sensation of bricks peeking through the plaster, I added on top of this a grunge map to be used in combination with the one obtained from the roughness map. To complete the first part of the texturing process, I created a lighter variation of the tile stone material to be applied for the traceries and other meshes here and there. For the floor, I devoted something like 10 to 15 minutes of time within Substance Designer to create a sort of generic tile pavement. Nothing fancy here, I simply used a tile generator node and some slope blur grayscale nodes to get the base material in place, along with some finer normal detail for the edges of each tile. I then used grunge maps to add even finer details, this time to the surface of the tiles, and finally a gradient map sourcing the reference image for the albedo map and a checker mask to be composed on top of it to obtain the final look. With that done, I brought everything into Blender and I started applying the floor material to each different section of the pavement, adjusting the scale as needed. Now onto the stained glasses. For this, I tried a few different workflows before coming up with a decent solution. At first, I tried to create my own patterns by using alpha packs I got from the web. I imported the ones I chose into Photoshop to create an albedo map and an updated alpha mask. With those ready, I would move to Substance Painter, where I would leverage on both the paint along path as well as standard fill layers to populate my windows with the chosen patterns. Finally, I would export the resulting albedo and normal maps to be tested in Blender, using them as inputs in a generic glass material shader. I would then simply iterate the process as to have all the desired patterns in place. In Blender, I would start playing around with the transmission factor of the BSDF shader to give the windows a bit of transparency, and with the emission strength factor and color input as well. This kind of workflow gives for sure a lot of control on the patterns to be displayed, but it requires a lot of effort to get a decent amount of variation to begin with. And whenever I needed a simple change, for instance to the palette of the chosen colors for each pattern, I would need to go back and forth from different softwares. Plus, it was pretty hard to achieve an acceptable level of complexity with regards to the patterns themselves, as I was limited by many external factors such as the alphas available, their quality, and how easy it would have been to repurpose them for this specific need. For these reasons, in the end I decided to ditch this workflow entirely and to try something different. I went back to Pinterest and I started looking at real stained glass patterns, like actual photos. I tried to avoid anything that could contain evident light information to keep it as neutral as possible, or that could be excessively tricky to tile, as my intention was to use these photos directly as albedo maps. In Painter it would go like this. I imported the chosen image as a texture and I would then add a fill layer with just the color and roughness channels enabled. I put the roughness down to 0 and sourced my texture as the base color. I then switched the projection to triplanar, added the layer to a group with a black mask on it, and I then added to this mask a paint layer to define where the texture would need to be displayed. I would then rescale and reposition the texture based on my needs. On the fill layer containing the texture, I added a levels filter to control its overall look, and then I made it into an anchor point. This would allow me to create another layer containing just the height information. I would add a black mask here too, with a fill layer to be used to load the information contained in the anchor point just created and use it to generate reliefs. In fact, by doing this, the original albedo texture would be automatically converted into a grayscale image that can be used to produce bumps coherently with the image pattern itself. At this point, I used a blur filter to make the bump map as smooth as possible without losing too many details. This is a pretty quick way to create complex patterns, mostly in a non-destructive way, where it is easier to try out and switch different patterns with just a few clicks. In Blender, I imported the albedo and normal maps produced in Painter. Here I would use the color texture also as the input for the emissions color, and I would start playing around with the emission strength, with transmissions weight, and with the metallic factor of the shader to achieve the desired result. The final result is indeed a bit washed out, and that's due to the fact that I still had to prefer light over look, otherwise the shot would have been way too dark. But anyway, I intend to build upon this foundation for future projects, so let's consider this as just a test for now. After all of this modeling and texturing, and after having found some decent spots for my cameras and having added just a simple HDRI for the overall lighting of the scene, this finally was the end result. Again, a lot of things to be improved for sure, but nevertheless, this project, although quite tiring at times, allowed me to strengthen my understanding around a few of the workflows I already knew and let me explore new ones. And that, all considered, is always a win. Let me know what you think in the comment section and whether you attempted to create something of this scale yourself and how it went. For now, thank you for watching and see you next time.